introducing all the participants. Obviously, in this session, we'll be talking about trust as one of the potential drivers and tools for promoting economic growth. Naturally, after the presidential address yesterday, it's sort of natural that we may lean on this discussion towards issues like what kind of trust can you have in a society right after a particular reshuffle of the government. So here we have Alexei Kudrin, who is the head of the Accounts Chamber, German Grev, who is the president and chairman of Sberbank, Michael Woolcock, lead expert of the World Bank, Paul Polman, founder and chairman of Imagine. Well, at the same time, he's the head of International Trade Chamber. Also, we have Alexander Auzan, who is the dean of the Department of Economics at Moscow State University. Esko, a former Prime Minister of Finland in 1991-1995 and currently Senior Advisor of the East Office of Finnish Industries. Andrei Nikitin, Governor of Novgorod region, is also participating in the discussion. Thank you very much. Let's welcome our speakers again. Thank you. My first question goes to the audience here. Please raise your hand if you believe, or just vote if you believe that in 2019 people started putting more trust in governmental institutions, in public institutions. Not a single hand raised. Okay. Tomorrow, we're going to publish this rating from Edelman Trust Barometer, which is going to show if there was any increase in trust. But actually, I can, I can steal the show from Edelman and tell you that actually Russia ranked last in this particular rating. However, it's based on a pretty small sample. Thanks to Paul, who suggested that it is a more interactive session, we are going to be using Menti. So please grab your smartphones. You will have opportunities for voting during the first several presentations, and then Paul is going to comment on the voting results. So please take a snapshot of the numbers at the top of the screen. That's 68, 52, 24, and share those numbers with your less lucky neighbors, because we are going to use the screen now. I understand that Alexei Kudrin will not need these slides, so we can keep it up. But first, let me show you the questions. So you need to go to menti.com, enter those 6 digits, and you're going to see the questions that Paul has proposed that you vote on and that he's going to comment on them. So all of them are related to global context, because naturally one of the key factors in trust is social inequality. So, if most people would benefit from enhancing equality, why have voters not elected politicians who would prioritize and implement policies to do exactly that? It is indeed phrased as a global question. However, you are free to vote as you please. So, there are several potential answers here. Number 1, politicians are not aware of how serious the issue is and how its potential long-term impact is growing. Number 2, politicians are distracted with other issues, so not prioritize inequality as the one to be addressed. 3, politicians don't believe that inequality issue might be addressed anyway systemically. Number 4, there is a lack of strong social voice supporting real actions for better equality. That is, people vote for politicians who don't prioritize the inequality problem solving. And 5 is that politicians ignore this issue deliberately. While you're voting, I would like to ask Alexei Kudrin to tell us about what he thinks about this issue of trust. After all, Mr. Kudrin has raised this issue a number of times at different fora, so this could be a very good warm-up for the whole session. So what do you think currently about trust, about economic growth, and trust in public institutions in particular?
Thank you. Assessing economic policy by the government, I would focus on the real steps by the government. Assessing trust confidence in economic policy is one of the key recipes, is one of the key ways to adapt reforms. I'll go back to it. The topic of the panel session is very important, but I'd like to cite the Edelman Trust Barometer figures. What are the latest figures? The last year's figures, actually. The fresh ones will come out tomorrow. So the latest data that we have, 2018 versus 2017. There are 26 countries. Trust overall was growing. However, Russia was an outlier. There was a country where trust was down. China, Indonesia, and India are key competitors, and that's where confidence in the government was growing. And they're even close to us in terms of GDP per capita. So these are our peers. So they managed to get the trust on the upward curve. So for several years running, we are the last one. And last year, there was a 7% drop. So there are 4 components. Trust to NGOs, we are down 2%. Trust towards the business community, down 7 points. And trust towards the media, 9 points. This is a critical situation indeed. So as a sum up, if we are to define the right action plan of reforms, and the government would say that it would implement it persistently, but if there's no trust at ground zero, then the success of these reforms are doomed, because you always have to take steps that might be out of favor with someone. But the population needs to be sure that someone would win, someone would lose eventually, because of the recalibrating of the balance resource, of the budget resources. But overall, the society needs to develop in a faster way. Incomes should be growing faster, and we always need to go to the means-tested, targeted approach of issuing allocation, of issuing benefits. Out of 36% of social benefits, is 11% of them are those to the needy. But only 20% of that amount reaches the impoverished ones. So that huge social support doesn't end up in the right hands. So we can redistribute that from just a blanket support of the population. We need to have more targeted social assistance to those who are really in the needy category. So you would take these benefits from someone and you would give more to those who are really struggling. That would definitely anger someone, but you'll have to do it and take any economic reform. Today we need higher competition, and someone would suffer from that. We need to stop supporting inefficient, weak enterprises. We have to give them more subsidies. So let's issue less subsidies, and competition would grow, although some enterprises would suffer. So confidence is a major element. So as I said earlier, the government needs to have a dedicated program that would send a signal and would show, here's what we had to do, here's what we have done. And particularly, these have to be some issues which are critically important for the business community and for the people. Now, my second point is that what is also important is to have some change in terms of our leaders. There's fatigue, some of the promises are not met, so we need fresh blood, we need a fresh team, fresh ideas. A new team would get a new mandate for the reforms, would get trust. So many countries have it enshrined in their law that there should be political competition, that cabinets should replace each other. There should be a change at the political level, so it does not fully function here in Russia. What we saw yesterday, a change, a reshuffle in government, raised some hopes with the people that the new team would be able to achieve more, that the new prime minister would be able to rebalance the interests of the government and the business community. I mean, I'm referring to Mr. Mishustin. So he's been able to work out some new mechanisms to administer taxes. So taxation stopped being one of the pains for the business community. He's aware of digitalization. He knows that all these new technologies are critically important to kickstart the economy. He's aware of that. And so all of these factors point to the fact that we finally have more hopes for more reforms. So this is why we finally have hope today. Thank you. Thank you. We always want to hope for the better. So I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Auzan. You're one of the biggest experts on trust. But before I give you the floor, here's one thing I recalled. We did a focus group session at one point. We looked at trust to such a measure as cancelling personal income tax for the needy ones, for the impoverished ones. So at first the focus groups said, yes, this is the right measure. But then the focus group respondents start thinking, okay, but if the government would think that we are wealthy, that the government would increase taxes for us, and then they start to think in different categories, in different terms. So 15 minutes and the tone has changed completely. So what do you think? Is it part of our DNA or what? Colleagues, so why do we need trust per se? This slide is a clear illustration of what we need. This is research by two French economists, Auzan and Shklyaruk. They study the dependence of GDP per capita to a level of trust. So if we had the same level of trust as in Sweden, and Sweden is one of the leaders of trust, general trust, trusting your counterpart. So if you had the same level, then GDP would be higher in every country. But in Russia, it would be higher by 69%. So you'd have a 1.5 increase in GDP, something what macroeconomists think is not feasible. We can do it if we are to increase our level of trust by twofold. So we're lagging behind. We have just half of what Sweden has. It's because of frictions. It's because of transaction costs. You need collaterals, lawyers. If you don't trust your counterparts. And as one of the sayings in Russia goes, you can only be 100% sure if you get 100% advance payment. So can we change the situation? Mary is asking the right question. Maybe it's part of our DNA. Maybe we can't do anything about it. Okay. Right now, I'm not going to talk about institutional trust. I'm going to talk about general personal trust, because institutional trust, trust towards government is just one aspect of it. Now, here's some insightful data on twins. Intellect, well, that's part of your DNA, and that's not a very pleasant thing. Even our religious and political views are defined by our DNA, for the level of 25%. As for trust, only 20% of it is part of DNA. So you can change trust. Next slide, please. So that's the map of trust globally. The darker the color, the higher trust is. Now, there are two leaders, two types of leaders. Sweden, North America, that's one type, and then China and Egypt. You see, they are really, really dark blue. Arab countries in general. What does that mean? So what's the real mechanism behind trust? In the theory of games, you have a dilemma of two prisoners, two inmates. So if you confess, then you will be released, and the second will be jailed for a long time. But if both of you keep silent, then all of you sort of might escape responsibility. So that dilemma was later used by economists. So what you need to do is to have trust in your partner. And there's some guarantor that would stand over you. And there are two types of guarantors, either institutions, judges, laws, and that's what you have in North America and Sweden, or culture, when everyone says, no, you can't behave in a different way, and that's what happens in China and Egypt. It doesn't always yield economic growth. Trust is not always very good. Sweden has higher level of trust, but GDP per capita is not the highest one. So it's all about the balance, it's all about synergy. How should I put it? I like this slide as a researcher, but I don't really like it as a Russian citizen. I feel bitterly disappointed for Russia. Here's Estonia, a former Soviet republic, that it has been able to achieve a twofold progress. So you have both the European Social Survey and the World Value Survey. It has it achieved a twofold increase in less than 2 decades. Well, culture is slow to change, but institutions can change very fast. So they changed those institutions. But they didn't copy-paste Finnish institutions. It might be close in terms of the language, but they focused more on and relied more on the German institutions, and they were closer in values. And economic indicators are also quite high. So I'll stop here for a second, and in the second round I'll talk about Russia, what Russia can do. Thank you. Thank you. You always need to have some kind of suspense. So you talked about that inmate dilemma, but you didn't tell the true story. So one will be released only if the second one keeps silent. But if both say something, then you will be jailed. So you always have to be aware of our constitution and the rights you're given. So in any case, you need to look at other people and how they behave, and you always have to rely on social capital, on reputation, and other aspects that contribute to trust. So here's my next question. So first we'll set the tone, and I'd like to ask Michael Woolkirk to tell us how social capital can impact trust and how can it impact the development of the country in general. And can you compare these characteristics? Is there any major difference in economic indicators of countries? Is there any dependence in terms of trust and economic indicators?
Much for including me as part of your conversation today. I'm just going to briefly introduce this idea of social capital, which some of you have heard of, but maybe some of you have not. It's a broader concept. It has been debated for over 100 years by various different scholars. There's a broad agreement on that now. The OECD came up with a definition a few years ago that it referred to the networks together with shared norms, values, and understandings that facilitate cooperation within or among groups. Right? So it's this idea of what are these different social processes that enable people to do things together that they could not do on their own. And thus, social capital was seen as another form of asset in the same way that our education and our knowledge is an asset, in the same way that our resourcing and our technology and our machines are resources, in the same way that land is a resource. So you can have lots of these different things, but the power of a modern economy is that its people drive are the main creators of economic wealth. And in some countries, those work together very well, and in many countries, they do not. So the idea, as the previous speaker mentioned, is that it really just helps to lower the cost of doing anything. And let me give you a specific example. If you travel to New Zealand, for example, and you fly on an airplane within the country, there is zero security that you have to go through. You will never have to you will never have to go through a metal detector. You won't even be asked to show your identification, right? So think of how much money is spent just even getting us into this room, all right? We've had to go through multiple layers of security. We have to wear security badges because we have to be careful, right? But if you go to New Zealand, you can travel internally. Even when I was there, which was 1 week after the massive bombing occurred there, where 50 people died, right? Even after a major national disaster like that, what is the response from the society? To be more nervous, to be more paranoid about people that might try to blow them up? Or no, just to keep on not letting those kinds of activities disrupt your way of life. And so it's only when you go to a country, New Zealand, and you experience something like that, that you really get to feel what a high social capital country actually feels like. So I've just really explained two different dimensions of social capital. There is the social capital between people, between a group defined in some particular way, and then other groups of people. And so we have us and we have them. And how us and them figure out how to get along or not is a really key bearer of this thing called social capital. But it's also how we interact with people that are more powerful than us, people who are in positions of authority. And that is a more vertical form, but it's also very crucial for giving legitimacy to governments and being able to let and allow various forms of authority to be enacted upon us. But this particular dimension, I think, is one where there's perhaps greater opportunity for policy innovation. It's very hard to try and manipulate or change through public policy how individuals interact with each other. But I think one of the defining characteristics of a country that is very mature in its social capital and its social relationships, as I mentioned up on this quote there from the great historian Christopher Bailey, is that what you want to have happen is that your society becomes sociologically benign. Well, what does that mean? It means that your demographic characteristics, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're from some particular ethnic group or some particular religious group, whether you're good looking or not good looking, all of those things just don't matter. You trust people, right? But if you go to a country like Papua New Guinea, for example, only 5 million people, but they have 820 official languages in that country. So there is a lot of us and a lot of them. And it's very hard to forge a common understanding of who we are, what the collective is. So those kinds of countries, two very different kinds of extremes between a country with low transaction costs where everybody trusts everybody else, and countries where people can't even communicate with each other so often, and so thus have to be very distrustful or very hesitant in their interactions with each other. Those are two very different kinds of worlds for doing the task of setting up a business, for voting people into elections, for choosing who you're going to get married to. All of those complicated or not so complicated aspects of life all turn on the extent to which these social relationships can be structured. The next slide, please. So those are the general ideas. When we've tried to measure these things and put them into a policy framework, a few years ago I did helped with many other people to prepare this big study on trust in the Middle East. And you might think, well, there's a pretty interesting part of the world where there isn't a lot of trust, perhaps, so much war, so much long-standing discontent. And we were able to show in that particular study that one of the ways in which you can assess the trust in a society is to look at people's perceptions of public services, the everyday experience of going to school or going to a medical clinic or watching whether your road gets fixed when a pothole appears in it. Right? These are everyday services, not very spectacular or sexy ones, but they are what shapes everyday life. And we were able to show there that when citizens are dissatisfied with these things that they rightly expect of their government, that all of those things help to decrease the quality of trust more generally, not just in the providers of those services, but more generally. So one way we can think about trying to improve trust is to try and get the everyday things in life working more effectively. We also show that one of the ways in which trust goes down is when people perceive that their connections matter more than their qualifications or their merit for whether they get a job, right? So it becomes a world in which who you know matters more than what you know, right? Well, there's an example of the ways in which social connections can be used for unproductive purposes. They mean that you get special favors if you know the right people or you have the right name. And so one of the ways in which we can try to improve trust is to be able to ensure that indeed people are hired on the basis of their merit, of their qualifications. And so the people who are getting the jobs are the best people for those jobs. But the big killer of trust, the thing that really erodes it, is when corruption happens, when people in power use their positions of authority to benefit themselves rather than to benefit everybody else. And many, many scholars and practitioners have wrestled with this challenge over many years, and we still don't have an answer to that. But I'm just trying to show that really is the big issue that I think empirically undermines the level of trust in a society. Next slide, please. The next slide, can we have that? Yeah, thank you. One other way in which we've tried to do this is to look at the actual effectiveness of trust as an asset in a society and how much it contributes to the overall wealth of a society. And in very distrustful societies, as you can see on the left there, countries with very low levels of trust, the amount of that contributes to the economy is just very, very small. It means that you're having to depend exclusively on other things than trust, and you have these high transaction costs which make just doing business and everyday life in those societies very costly and thus very inefficient. On the right-hand side, you see at the bottom the Sweden and Denmark, where you have very high levels of social capital, but we estimate that roughly about half of their wealth in that country, half of that wealth, is derived from, emerges out of this high level of trust that everybody has in each other, and especially in organizations, and especially in their government. When we looked at Russia on this data, it was roughly the same as Portugal and Lithuania, and we would guess, or our calculations would show that roughly about 20% of the wealth of Russia comes from its existing form of trust. Now you might think that's maybe too high or too low. Maybe there are lots of other countries where trust is way lower than it is here in Russia. Trust me on that. But nonetheless, it means that there's roughly a 30% gap between what is and what could be. And if Russia was, as the previous speaker said, if Russia had the same level of trust as Sweden or Denmark, it would be able to be so much wealthier than it actually is. And so all of that distrust just has this very consequential effect on the net wealth of society. One final point in this last round. Next slide, please. One of the other ways in which we can look at the importance of social capital, on the next slide. is looking at the way in which societies respond to bad things that happen to them. Right? When a natural disaster or a war of some kind happens, there's always a variation in the extent to which different communities respond to that. And some very interesting research on social capital has looked at various different disasters that have occurred in different countries and at different times, and looked at the extent to which the different communities respond to those awful things that have happened to them. And so this particular study, the details of which I won't go into, but really shows that the communities that anticipate these problems, that then respond to them most effectively, are these communities with high social capital. So whether it's thinking about these things just because we care about them for their own sake, because our social relationships are so important to us, or whether we try and measure these things in terms of how they contribute to a nation's wealth, or how they help us deal with unhappy events, all of these things really show, I think, that social capital and the key component of that, this thing called trust, all of those things are really, really important. And so as we think about economic policy and how to improve welfare, I think we can increasingly make it a strong empirical case as well as a strong normative case that this social capital is such an important contributor. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое. Пока выводят результаты.
Thank you so much. We'll have a look at the poll, and I'll have to voice it. We don't have English translation for the votes. Well, Mr. Greff, as I listen to other speakers, I recalled you saying that it's hard to manage what you cannot measure. So there are 4 or 5 ways to measure trust. Can you really do it? Can government really measure trust? I'll go back to you after Paul provides his commentary on the results of the vote. So number 1 is that politicians deliberately ignore the issue. Most of the people voted for that. The second one is that politicians don't believe you can change the situation in a systemic way, and trailing behind is that the politicians do not appreciate the importance of the issue. So apart from inequality, the issues of trust is often the gap between words and action. And well, some say that there should be a program, as Mr. Auzan said, here's what we promised, here's what we did. Just put together a matrix. Very often, corporate culture, organizational culture is the real reason between what you say and what you do. So what can be an indicator that it has changed and it can be trusted? But first, I'd like you to comment on the outcome of the poll.
Может, ты к кому обратился?
So, Paul, can you comment on the outcomes of the vote?
I'll go by what you told me because I can't really see which votes relate to which question. But it's a very timely one, and actually it doesn't surprise me. I think the first 2 things you say is politicians ignore, and they believe that they can change themselves. So a certain level of apathy are the top 2. Is that what you said? Mm-hmm. Because I'll comment on that, and then Mr. Kudrin was already rightly alluding to the levels of trust that are needed and changes in governments that might help in getting fresh faces. The reality of the new Edelman survey is probably not surprisingly showing that trust is down again in most places, and unfortunately going down faster than we expected. And even countries that were very high on the trust list, like the UK, after all the things, and I happen to live there some of my time, it's now the second lowest on trust. It's not surprising there. So the correlation that is 100% shown at the in the Edelman survey as well, but in many other things, is a correlation between trust and inequality. And we can have a long debate about the chicken and egg, but that's not really important. The reality is that the cost of trust, as you call it, or the cost of inequality is enormous, be it in violence, or be it in lower cost of health, or be it in happiness and satisfaction, and many of the other things that you talked about as what you called social trust. I've always gone back to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, as sort of the wake-up moment of a morality crisis, because I think we discovered that our economic system was based on high levels of corporate debt or private debt, high levels of overconsumption, and frankly leaving too many people behind. And in any system where you leave too many people behind, it will ultimately rebel against itself. And that is what you see reflected in trust, if I keep it simple. You know, I've heard people say that in the crisis, and it obviously played out more in Western Europe and the US, but that's a big part of the global economy. But people were literally saying, you know, I understand what is happening. Banks are too big to fail and people are too small to matter. And if we live in an environment like that, then it's not a very good story. So it erodes the social trust, it erodes the institutional trust. So the cost of inequality is very high. And the sad part of it is that the cost of inequality has been rising all over the world. I mean, without bothering anybody with the statistics, you're well familiar with that. But because we're in Russia right now, I looked at some of the Russian statistics, and they would be the same, by the way, in the US. In the US, you have 60 million people living about $400 away from poverty. Their car needs to break down, or a medical bill in the family, and they're wiped out. It is the reason why we now have the Sustainable Development Goals being universal goals, is because the goal of not leaving anybody behind is now true in any country. The difference between developed and developing countries is actually far less in what we need to do than some people understand. But we've talked about corruption, we've talked about distrust, we've talked about inequality, and undoubtedly they're all very closely linked. The issues that the question is referring to, and that's why I thought with a panel of this size it's better to have some interaction with the audience as well, but ignorance or apathy and a feeling that you can't do anything about it is very much also what you see in some other issues. That's the same discussion we would be having on climate change with many politicians. It's actually the same discussion we would be having on reforming financial markets. It's also the same discussion we have around cybersecurity or the fast pace of tech and all the pluses and minuses that the fourth industrial revolution brings with it. So I think the issue is not necessarily a Russian issue, where obviously inequality has been badly affected. I was looking at some numbers, and I don't know if they're true, but 40% of the people here as well are poorer than they were in the old Soviet system, according to the statistics, and 66% of the people can barely afford their base necessities. And the problem that exacerbates this in this country is that you basically depend on 2 or 3 regions, and that you have such a high dependence on one part of your income to help these things, which is fossil fuel, which is a no-no in a few years from now. So the challenge that you have to re-establish that trust, to recreate a more level playing field for more people, is not something I envy you about. But it's the global issues that I alluded to, I think, of climate change, financial markets, cybersecurity, that each country increasingly feels that they can't attack alone. And that's why I want to come back to another aspect of the social capital that you talked about, that the most important thing right now is something that Einstein said, which is the definition of insanity is to try to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And with that, the same notion of trying to solve the problems at the same level that they are being created is not very good. We are all in this together in the world now with these major issues that we have around some of these global challenges of climate change and inequality probably being the biggest ones, but some other ones. And yet the systems that we have designed globally to deal with that don't function anymore. Most of these systems are from the Bretton Woods time in 1944. Anybody that has run a company, I ran Unilever for 10 years, would probably in that period since 1944 would have adjusted their strategy 10, 15, 20 times to stay alive. We haven't done that in the global system. So mechanisms like now the WTO or the OECD or the World Bank or the IMF, they're simply not capable to deal with this global governance, and it causes paralysis at global level. It causes paralysis at political level. We can be cynical about politicians, but that's not a solution. The solution, obviously, is to say we've benefited for a long time from a political environment that was good. We've lifted 1 billion people out of poverty just in the last 2 decades alone. We're all sitting here in a fairly comfortable situation because, fortunately, we had some responsible politicians. Now that we go into a period probably of the next 10, 15 years where global politics is very difficult, we need to form new forms of partnerships, new forms of working together. And there, my point is the private sector. Implementing these sustainable development goals will cost about $3 to $5 trillion a year. It's actually not that much on a global economy of 80 trillion. We're actually spending far more on costs that we are incurring by not making the corrections than what it would actually cost to implement. But the only way that we can implement these sustainable development goals and address these issues of trust and inequality is by having the private sector now step up. The private sector is the bulk of job creation, financing, and innovations, technology, and people. So you need to get them involved. So here you find the new future, the new next 10 years, that new forms of partnerships where private sector needs to step in, help de-risk the political process, work with civil society together, and start to implement and help implement the new policies, basically de-risking the political process. You start to see that happen on climate change, where the private sector, I think at this moment, and widely recognized by many, is running ahead of the governments who are basically paralyzed right now. The financial market is starting to move very rapidly in the direction of decarbonizing our global economy. They have understood that that is the future that we need to work towards if we want to stay alive, but also if we want to stay competitive. And increasingly, they will be the engines then to drive, hopefully, the government. Direction is clear, in my opinion, but the bigger challenge is speed and scale. And that can only happen with a form of partnership that underpins what you are saying on this social trust, which is a higher level of morality where you put the interest of others ahead of your own, knowing that by doing so, you're better off yourself as well. My wife wrote an interesting book called Imaginal Cells, which deals with basically the transformation of the caterpillar. It eats a lot, a little bit like our consumption mentality, overeats actually, goes into a cocoon, and then starts to disintegrate. A little bit what you see happening with our global economy. As it disintegrates, imaginal cells come alive, which send signals to each other. At first, the other cells try to reject it and kill it off, sees it as an enemy. But these imaginal cells come together and form this beautiful butterfly. I think we're in need for more imaginal cells to solve this world's problem, which at the end is a moral problem, which at the end is an issue of leadership. So that's why I always say we need more leaders and trees. There's one thing that works in every country, everywhere. It also works in every religion, from Judaism to Islam to Christianity to any other that you want to have, which is basically the golden rule, which is do unto yourselves, and I would add to that the planet as you want, do unto others and the planet as you want to have done unto yourselves. And if we would just, as a basic principle, start to live that and actually act like that in people that run our companies, that run our politics, in these levels of responsibility, I think it would go a long way in restoring trust. So this is where we are. We need more leaders and we need more trees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now, coming back to the issue of trust, I'd like to turn now to Mr. Greff. I've got 3 questions, but they are interrelated. Has this discussion led you to think that trust can be measured? And do you think we can have a trust-related KPI for a large corporation or a government? So do you think it's a good idea to work exclusively on building trust? And if so, how can it be achieved? Thank you very much, Maria. If that's okay with you, I'd like to start slightly differently, because I think panel discussions are about debates primarily. So, I'll start with the prisoner's dilemma, if I may. A prisoner's dilemma, or the prisoner's dilemma, is a great example of, how mathematics shows you shouldn't trust, because a certain level of distrust is what benefits you most in the prisoner's dilemma. Because if you trust and your partner distrusts, like your partner goes free and you end up behind the bars, which is suboptimal, right? And this sort of leads to a pretty horrible realization that treachery is the optimal mode of behavior. Marie, you're much better positioned to adjudicate on this particular matter. When we adopted a law on plea bargains and plea agreements, it turned out like 70 or 80% of cases show that, well, I don't know about other countries, but in this country, you should never, ever try to plea with the prosecution. And, I think that in certain countries, like Russia, what you see with the prisoner's dilemma is that the innocent parties tend to lose. The guilty parties are happy, to be the first to speak up and blame it all on the innocent party. I think this is a serious issue for this country. I'm happy Alexander mentioned it. I think this is something that both economists and lawyers need to look at, because given our DNA and given our horrendously low level of trust, using tools like this may be counterproductive. Well, do you know that Russian courts are mind-bogglingly prone to send people to jail? Like 99% of all cases are ruled like this. So, it's a major issue for the economy, it's a major issue for the country. If you don't put any trust in such an important institution as the court system, what kind of trust can we be talking about? I'm sorry, I absolutely had to mention it, because I believe this is a major illegal issue that absolutely needs to be addressed, because people who came up with this idea, with this legal innovation for the Russian Federation, I think they knew nothing about the prisoner's dilemma. And this has created this major problem for the Russian legal and court system. And this should be our first step towards destroying inequality and building trust. And what we're seeing here is indeed a zero-sum game. Why is it a zero-sum game? Well, because economic policy in this country is, in most cases, a zero-sum game. We are trying to please one part of the population by taking something away from another stratum of the population. How can you build trust if this is the only game you can play? If we are talking macroeconomics, obviously the optimal policy is the one that is targeting optimum, that leads to expansion of the pie rather than redistribution of the pie. I think we are having this major issue with distrust because we are expecting the government to try redistributing things again. Like, we know deep down that the state will come calling, will come rapping on the door and demanding your money again in some new way by introducing new taxes, because we know that the only way Russian government tries to please certain groups of Russians is by taking money away from other Russians. We are in fact, putting this time bomb under our own institutions. We are creating distrust by our policies, with our policies. How do we go about it? How can we measure it? And yes, I do agree that this is one of the major challenges for macroeconomists. And I can also point out that it's a major challenge as far as corporate governance is concerned as well. You know, I was exposed to it in my time in the Ministry of Economics, but this is the same kind of challenge I'm facing as a corporate officer. Because one of the key factors of your success is the trust you command with your consumers, with your clients, and your employees. And if you don't have any trust, you can't be successful as a politician or a businessman. Now, if you don't have this trust, then transaction costs will be so high. That's exactly what we've been talking about. And this brings us back to this case of New Zealand, where people don't feel they need to lock their doors. So increasing the level of trust is the surefire way of decreasing transaction costs and becoming more productive. Some African scientists, I think, said, you know what, we have a democratic hardware, but a very authoritarian software. Now, you're asking us this question whether we can turn into Swedes. And this makes me think of a joke about mice, whether they're able to turn into hedgehogs for strategic reasons or not. I'm not sure. I actually don't believe we can become Swedes. You know, this is part of our cultural DNA, part of our cultural code. We are Russians, so this is imprinted in our brains. And this nation is one of the hardest hit in the 20th century. You know, this country alone lost like 70 million people, 7-0, in less than 100 years. You know, we were badly beaten in 2 world wars, or badly hit, and we also exterminated millions of our own residents. You know, very often, you know, we hear from other people like, why aren't you like the rest of the world? Like, come on, we have had a very different history. We cannot be like the rest of the world. And, well, nobody can. Everybody had their special history. Like, most people here, you know, were born in the Soviet Union. And we have the Soviet Union still imprinted in us. And, you know, we cannot perform, you know, an acrobatic feat that will turn us into Swedes. Even though we would love to, I guess. We cannot become Swedes, you know. You cannot turn shrubs into trees even if you water them every day. We are shrubs. I hope it doesn't sound offensive. So I think we need to be realistic when we go about goal setting. You know, scientists, you know, they have this freedom to daydream as much as they like. But we, as managers or leaders, we have to be realistic. Like, very often I'm asked this question, say, you have this great expert, like, he knows his stuff, and he's, say, a great software engineer or a trader, but he's a value destroyer in his team. Like, he's so crappy, nobody wants to deal with him. Well, my answer is very simple. He can be a genius, technically speaking, but if he's destroying value, I will fire him today. Unless I know of a magical way to change his DNA, but it's very difficult, you know, DNA or like cultural DNA, which is, you know, not that much determined by your genes, because that's also the upbringing you had. But even changing that is nearly impossible. It is so much easier to fire and hire than to nurture the right kind of values in people. there is another important factor here, which is PDI, Power Distance Index. This country has a very high level of PDI, which needs to be taken into consideration. We are no Sweden, come on. In Sweden, PDI is one of the lowest in the world. So what do we do about it? I've been struggling with this question for some time. My conclusion is that there is no minister more important in any country than the Minister of Education. Minister of Finance, Minister of Economy are important as well, but nobody is as important as the Minister of Education. I'm talking education as in primary schools and secondary schools. And I'm happy that President Putin actually mentioned preschools. And he actually said something about education curriculum for preschoolers and kindergartens for children aged 1 to 3. Now that sounds like fantasy to me. We don't really have anything in this respect in the country now. I will be happy if we introduce good programs for 3+. And we don't have a GOS, which is like national standard. And the standard that we have, or the one that's in the works now, I totally disapprove of because it says nothing about developing soft skills, which I consider to be critically important. This is so essential that we teach children how to interact with each other. Actually, we need to teach children that besides Darwin, we also had Kropotkin, who told everybody how important it was to collaborate, and that collaboration and win-win is actually a better, in the long run, strategy in most situations. And this is something that needs to be conveyed in schools and in families. But this is a long shot, and this is something that gets changed over a very long period of time. I fully agree with what Alexei and Alexandra said. If you don't have trust among your business partners, you cannot run any economic reforms. There is another important principle, that is under-promise and over-deliver. Now, I remember one of the first appearances of Putin in Davos, and the famous question, who is Mr. Putin, and can we expect Mr. Putin to run any reforms? And Grigory, I think Yavlinsky, was asked this question back then, and he said, well, he'll make all sorts of promises and he won't do anything. I was asked the same question, and I said, come on, what kind of answer do you expect from me? Let's wait a couple of years and see. And you know what? 2 years later, nobody asked this question because he was crystal clear by that time. So you cannot really earn trust with words. You only earn trust with action. And leaders must espouse and live up and live through, if you like, the values that they communicate. Thank you very much. I think this is indeed so true. Walking the talk, actually talking less, doing more is something that is missing in so many cases. And just like Alexei said, very often you need to first make unpopular decisions that may actually undermine trust even further. And here I would like to ask Esko, who is currently working in Finland, but he was previously Prime Minister of Finland. So what do you need to do when you need to make unpopular decisions that will undermine trust? Thank you.
For the first, my own experience is that first you have to do. Yesterday somebody said that reformer has to be like a self-bomber to understand that you are taking huge risk. And you have to wait 25 years and then you will get the reward. Then they say that you made reasonable decisions. The fact is that it's time-consuming to make reforms. It's time-consuming to to get a higher level of trust. But may I comment this, can Russia be like Sweden? We had similar question in Finland 1918. Can Finland be like Sweden? Because actually destroying trust is much, much easier than building trust. You can build trust in decades, but you can kill trust within days. And we were, Swedes are saying that Finland is a country of unrealized catastrophes. And actually, 1918, we were close to 2 catastrophes. We had civil war, we avoided socialist revolution, luckily, in my opinion. And then later, the same year, we avoided counter-revolution, because there were rather strong opinion in Finland on the right side of the political arena that we should cement everything what we have. And to cement everything when your level of trust is very low is a dangerous game. And luckily we avoided that catastrophe as well. And 1919 Finland started to create totally, or approach totally different way all the social and economic issues in the country. We were 1919 probably the poorest country in the Western world. Poorest country in the Western world. And if you ask me why Finland is what it is today, I think that we made 3 fundamental choices which had major impact in level of trust in Finland as well. For the first, we decided to create the future on the basis of the rule of law. We inherited that more or less from Sweden. So when we were part of Sweden, we had that tradition. Russia did not have that tradition. We were part of Russian Empire, but we were able to preserve that during that period of time thanks to the autonomy. Secondly, we decided that we will open access to social change or social development, so that by investing in education, in land reforms, all other social reforms, we open the doors for people to get access to higher level in the society. I don't believe that trust is based on the level of wealth or level of income. But if you have opportunity to feel that I can get better, if I feel personally that I can get better, that is fundamental issue when thinking about the level of trust. And I think Finland succeeded in that as well, thanks to those reforms made immediately after the civil war. And thirdly, confidence in institutions. And confidence in institutions means that everyone is treated equally. I fully agree what Mr. Gref said. It's a fundamental issue that legal system and institutions are acting in a way that everyone is able to believe that I'm equally treated. It doesn't matter if I'm poor or rich, if I'm coming from north or south, if I'm politically important or less important, I will be treated equally. And that creates trust in institutions. And institutions, democratic institutions, are a critical part of the level of trust. Second comment, I have quite often asked myself what trust actually means. We have discussed about trust, but I think we have in this room maybe tens or hundreds of different views. Many of you know Alexei Mordashov. We met roughly 15 years ago. And we decided to discuss differences between Finland and Russia, why Finland is doing like it is, why Russia is different. And we decided to go to Lapland, and we were driving with a car. And Mr. Moderator was asking me, Esko, what do you mean with trust? We were driving, it was a very narrow road along the bank of a river. And I had only a few seconds to try to find a solution. I didn't try to make theoretical analysis of trust, but I said, Alexei, there is a curve coming. You cannot see behind the curve. Car is probably coming. It's coming from the opposite direction. You will keep your line, but you believe that whoever is coming towards us is keeping his or her own line. It's a legal requirement, but no one has legal documents on with him or her in the car to decide how to drive. It's based on trust. We trust that others are acting equally like we are doing in this kind of situation. And I think this is the best way to tell what trust actually means. And finally, level of trust can be different not only between countries, but inside countries as well. The social capital was mentioned here. Bob Putnam, who is professor at Harvard, I have met him several times, and he wrote a book about Italy. And he explained how the level of trust or level of social capital in northern Italy is much higher than in the south. And he explained that by saying that civil society in the north is so much stronger that because of that, the level of social capital is higher as well. So I think it's important to understand that this is not only a question of between countries, it's also inside countries. It is very much cultural issue. And cultural issues are not very easy to be changed. And final comment. I think in politics we have a huge problem today, and it's a global problem. Paul Polman referred to that. What politicians are doing in social media environment? They are all the time campaigning. I'm old enough. I was in politics, active in politics in the 1990s. We were campaigning, but before elections. And then we moved to government or opposition. And in government, your role was govern, to take care of government. But now I feel that all the politicians are every day campaigning. And I don't believe that this is going to be sustainable. And this is destroying trust in societies as well. Thank you.
Well, the only person who told us what to do was Mr. Gref. So let's have another shot on how to achieve trust. Mr. Nikitin from the Nizhny Novgorod region. So here's my question. You're the governor, and this is a region where trust is not at the highest level. What have you done? What steps have been successful? We don't need negative case studies. What is the recipe for success in terms of increasing trust? Well, we had a couple of ideas. First was participatory budgeting, local initiatives. We spend so much money on roads, on social infrastructure, again, based on the social initiatives. There was a simple criteria. The more people decide that this has to be done, the higher the chance that this project will win. We supported about 30 projects, 30 townships out of more than 100 that we have in the region. And participation level was 90%. So we have 1,300 population and 1,000 people voted for that. So that's a great chance. And there were diverse projects. Some want to build a road, some want to have a gym or a sports playground for children. Some want to have a concert hall. So that's the best option. And that's the best thing that we've done. And we'll try to roll it out. We'll expand this initiative. Whatever we can do through social communities, through local communities, we'll do. So no coercion. We won't dictate anything on our part. And the second story was also successful. Social control. Being accountable. So you have this program in Moscow, you have it in Novgorod. When we demonstrate it, when we show that we are ready to punish those who should be held accountable, then we are on the same side as the people. you need to introduce these accountability systems, accountability frameworks, and you have to deliver on what you promised to the people. And the third option was taking decisions on social infrastructure. We're just making our first baby steps. And, you know, whenever we build some kindergarten, some preschool, people feel or people believe that it is being built close to a house of a wealthy official. We want to change that perception, and we try to pick the venues that are neutral. And I agree with Mr. Graf that the Ministry of Education is the key person. It's school and college that nurture soft skills. Together with the business community of the Nizhny Novgorod region, we are in dialogue. The best platform for me is college. That's the best platform where we discuss who we need to train, why do we need to train these kids, and what we invest into. And you can take any company that's interested in the future. So in the long term, education is the key aspect of raising trust. Thank you for your specific case studies. Now, Mr. Kudrin, you have to leave. You have to look at the new hope, as you dubbed it, a fresh face. So you'll be leaving soon. As I understand, maybe you can wrap it up, share some insights and three key takeaways, 3 steps to raise trust that we have to take right now once we have this inspiration. Indeed, at 2 p.m., the Parliament will have to approve the new Prime Minister. I'll be brief. Together with, okay, I'd like to clarify what I said, and I'd like to disagree with Mr. Graf on one thing. So, redistribution, is it always a zero-sum game or not? If we decrease subsidies to inefficient enterprises, this drives competition, opens up new opportunities. Companies don't want to be part of that laggards list because no one's going to help you. It, pushes your creative forces, and then we'll see more activity, more competition, more technology being introduced. So clarification on my part. Now, second, can we become Swedes? Well, our Finnish neighbor said that Finland used to be part of Sweden and used to be part of Russia. And it has now reached a certain standard, certain benchmark of what we can call a cultural code. But I would like to use another example. In the 1990s, Russia was a downbeat country that never paid on its debt. But in the in the 2000s, Russia was one of the best in the world in terms of contract discipline. We always paid, always delivered. So for 70 years, the entrepreneurial spirit was suppressed in the Soviet Union. So let our new generation compete. Let our new generation express their entrepreneurial spirit. Mr. Graf says it's also about trust. It's all about the rules. You need to have predictability. The rules shouldn't change, particularly in those innovative industries, in the high-tech industries. The more restrictions we have, the fewer creativity there will be, and people will go to other jurisdictions. And that applies to creativity, to arts. The more we ban expos, the fewer Chagalls, the fewer artists we will have. On the education minister, if the economy is fine, if finances are fine, then the education ministry is the key one, because they down those building blocks. The Ministry of Education focuses on upbringing, but that's not what you're referring to. Upbringing is like discipline, obeying your parents, but that's not enough. That's not sufficient. Now, on what we have to, on the action plan, the judiciary system, law enforcement, that's the worst in terms of trust. And that's what you have to start with. Actually, it's up to the president to resolve it, but the prime minister still has a lot of scope for what he can do. The prime minister can't protect economic freedoms. Here's an example. Our Center for Strategic Studies came up with a list of how we can improve the judiciary, or trust to the judiciary. 22 measures have been supported, endorsed on how to boost the transparency of the judiciary. All the lawyers gave their go-ahead on 18 measures. So the Executive Office of the President and the courts introduced 5 and 3 only partially. Well, why? Why only 3? And that ruins trust, that disrupts trust. So we can go back to some of the measures. It's not overarching reforms. These are major reforms that we proposed. Second, transparency and openness. The Munich Institute did a study which said that transparency on behalf of the government lowers, dampens any protests that might come out. You know, people might think that the government gave some money to oligarchs and then they would protest. So as the finance minister, I opened up all the contracts, all the procurement contracts from the federal level to the municipal level. It was unprecedented. Few countries in the world do that. And today, as the accounts chamber or the audit chamber, we launched a new tool, a new service. You call it government expenditure. You can look up any contract in a few clicks, and there's a dedicated indicator that you can use. You can look at hospitals, you can look at purchase of medicines. So transparency is a fundamental rule to boost trust, to consolidate trust, and strategic planning. If you agree this is a priority, you have to put it on the front burner. Your routine day-to-day operations should not kill that priority, should not undermine that priority. If we agree on some strategy, we shouldn't put it on the back burner. We shouldn't make it optional. If the government is in charge of the national projects, and if they don't deliver, they have to resign. There have to be accountability. If we don't have that culture, it doesn't work. The entire system doesn't work. Thank you. So while Mr. Kudrin is still here, one point from me. Trust by the business community. That's important, but it has to be a two-way street. If you don't trust the business community, then the business community doesn't trust you. The government needs to delegate something to the private sector. It's only the business community that creates and generates welfare, it generates that kind of value. I can only agree with you, Mr. Gref. I really love to moderate debates where we have Mr. Graf and Mr. Kudrin, because at a certain point you can stop moderating, they would start arguing, and at the final point they'll just say, I agree, and it's going to be exciting. Now, final slide. Can we put it up, Mr. Auzan's slide? Can we go back to the question what has to be done? But in the meantime, what about the cultural code? What about the judiciary? 2 months ago, a meme was popular on social media. You know, meme is usually a picture or some caricature where people were asked, do you trust the police and the judiciary? And everyone says, no, no. Do you want the death penalty back? Yes. Bring capital punishment. So we don't trust the government, but let's bring the capital punishment back. So what do we do? Mr. Auzan. Well, Mr. Gref, the prisoner dilemma is the favorite Russian topic. It's a popular theme in Russia. Doctors say there are no healthy people, there are just people who have not been diagnosed enough, who have not made enough tests. So, jokes aside, here's the fundamental thing. If you're never going to meet that person, then you're just going to betray that person. But if there are several rounds in that game, if you're going to meet that person again, then it's best to trust that person. So the bottom line issue is that, again, is it a short game or is it a long game? Because currently we all play a short game. This is why it's much easier to embezzle money, to steal money from the budget, than to invest in human capital. It's much easier to do. Okay, what else can we do to change that situation? Well, we didn't agree beforehand with Mr. Gref, but here's what I want to say. Here's what's happening in Russia. Social capital across Russia is slightly growing. 10–12% in the past 10 decades. Why? And it will start growing faster in the next years. Education, even poor education, but still, if it's education, that helps you to build trust. Currently, education is poor in thousands of colleges that were set up in the 1990s. It's not quite professional education, it's just literacy. But you still have the middle class coming out of those people. It's these people are aware that your gym is around the corner, you shouldn't drink bootleg alcohol, and that there are deposits and bonds which you can invest in. These are people with a high social capital. But this is like, you know, third-rate education. Now, the second factor, which would help to bring about this cultural shift, these new social aggregates, these new social platforms, it's not done by the government. So we might try to prevent Jack Ma and his Alibaba coming over with his aggregates. Or we can invent something by ourselves. That's what Mr. Gref's doing, that's what Sberbank doing, that's what Yandex is doing. And that system of aggregates, you know, enables trust. We have car sharing, which is growing popular. Moscow is top 1 in car sharing, and it has increased car sharing practices by 6 times within 12 months. Now, what everyone is interested in today when we'll see the approval of the new president, when the transit to a new power framework is launched, we need to do 3 things. Number 1, Mr. Gudrin said that trust is falling towards every institution. That's not quite so. According to the Levada Opinion Poll Center, trust is on the rise towards governors. Mr. Nikitin, over to you. Church, and at the same level, army and governors. There's some growth. Together with the Russian venture company, we did an annual poll across Russian regions to understand or it's been the environment for high-tech venture capitalists. Now, if you have higher trust towards regional authorities, towards governors, then there's a high level of entrepreneurial spirit. And usually it is the law enforcement, the siloviki, which acts as a sort of a cold shower, which tamp down that entrepreneurial spirit. So the law enforcement are the tools of violence, and there's always a distribution of that tools of violence. This is inefficient. You have to do it in a collegiate way. Between 1954 and 1991, there was a collegiate control over violence. There was no single person in charge of those siloviki. Currently, we have competition among the law enforcement agencies, and this is really bad. What we need to do is to have collegiate political control over the law enforcement agencies and look at their transaction costs. Remember, the president said there might be changes in the Federation Council. I think we need to transform the Security Council into a new body that will look at the commercial side of the economic aspects. Perhaps Mr. Medvedev could be head of it. Now look at the parliament. Economy-wise, the parliament just redistributes our taxes. They don't do anything. They just redistribute our taxes. But we don't understand it. We're not aware of it because Russians don't know that their tax is 50%. Our lawyers don't like it. When the VAT was increased, it's 50% higher than the US, lower than in Scandinavia, but generally at the European level. Who's in charge of our taxes? We don't know. This is why we need steps to increase our say. Taxpayers need to have a bigger say. Payroll taxes should be paid by individuals in that particular region. Moscow and St. Petersburg won't like it. They will lose their income. But people would start to be able to invest in their own lives, in their municipal life. You also need to have the selective tax. People need to vote. It's not just participatory budgeting. People need to have an opportunity to know where they want to spend part of their personal income tax. They might spend 30% into education, 30% into pension. Okay, now on courts. I don't think you will agree with me. I don't want courts to be independent or highly professional. I want courts to be to have a great reputation. Historically, there have been many instances where people somehow survived without the executive power and without the legislative power. You know, anarchy is possible, but without the judiciary, you cannot live. Someone has to be the arbitrator. Someone has to resolve these disputes. If the courts don't resolve our courts, someone else has to, you do that. Reputation is more important. It's not just about professionalism, it's about reputation. Both parties need to feel that this is a fair judgment. It's like jury. People pass the decision. Okay, we need to change the system of judges. Let judges be amateurs. They don't need to be professionals, but they need to be people of great standing, someone who possess great reputation. And that would also go alongside with education and stuff like that. I'd like to apologize, but we somehow need to stay within the time frame, so within the time slot, so we need to wrap up so that you can attend other sessions. I'd like to thank you all. And here are the key takeaways, the key steps that need to be taken to raise trust. Judiciary, meritocracy, picking the people not by their connections but by their knowledge, patience, under promise, over deliver, education, school. The focus is on soft skills, and delegate more, and let people have a bigger say on where their tax money goes. Thank you. I hope we'll see some of that going forward. Thank you so much.